Welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie and today I'm going to do a new tag that is like a victober or like Victorian literature themed one, and yes, it was created by people who were inspired by another person, so I will leave like links to all of that in the description box. Now I cannot remember the original name, but the person who made it into a tag is Roz from Scallydandling About the Books, I believe. And yeah, basically there are a couple rules about like how you choose. So you can't choose something that you just like reread loads and loads, but you have also read in the past 5 years. It doesn't have to be for the first time in the past 5 years, but like, yeah, can't be that you've read, you know, ever since you were a teenager or something. I don't really think anyone's going to be surprised at what's on my list, so I'll just, you know, get into it. The first one is the most recent that I read, because I read this year, and that's Middlemarch by George Eliot, which is a novel about a place called Middlemarch and kind of like the various people living there, their lives, their relation to kind of like politics and historical events like the Reform Act, their relationship with each other and with, I don't know, like humanness. It's also about romance and kind of like marriage and, you know, making wrong and right choices in relation to that. It's really beautiful and it's very, you know, it's a big novel and it's full of a lot of, I don't know, it's full of like loving kindness in a way, I think, and a sort of love and appreciation for humanity and for the sort of like imperfection of us. That's really wonderful to read, and yeah, it's a great story. It's got great characters. It's beautifully written. It's really interested in knowledge and science as well as kind of like feeling and fact. They kind of interrelate a lot in this. Yeah, I guess like the main sort of, one of the main centre points is Dorothea Brooke, who is, I guess like, is she like 18 when it begins, or is she like 21? She's like young when it begins, and then we kind of follow like her choices in life, but also there's a new doctor who's moved into town called Lydgate. There is a lot about like the history of medicine in this too, and kind of like, yeah, capitalist medical complexes. I mean, I guess I would say that fundamentally, well, there's also like a third kind of grouping, Fred, Vincy and Mary, oh no, I've forgotten her last name, and they're kind of like childhood friends. So we kind of followed like three sort of centerpieces, but there's lots and lots of people, and it all kind of comes together to have this really wonderful view of, yeah, just like a community of people. It's also silly in parts for sure, and yeah, I thought it was wonderful, and I don't think I'm ready to reread it yet, like, you know, but I am looking forward to when I reread it. But yeah, hopefully I'll read a bunch more George Eliot like in between that time. The next book is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, because like, of course, it's just like one of the most like agonizing, wonderful novels. I guess actually I was just thinking about Nightwood by Gina Barnes, which I have this great copy of, and how like this is also like a deeply unbearable book. It's, yeah, I definitely don't like it as much as I like Wuthering Heights, but it is like in the same kind of like literary sphere of just like deeply uncomfortable and like kind of just appalling depictions of life. Well, yeah, going from kind of like Middlemarch, which is like kind of this ecstatic acceptance of, yeah, like the flawedness of people, but in doing so we get to see the beauty of it. Wuthering Heights is like the inverse of that. Yeah, wait, Wuthering Heights really is just like evil George Eliot, which is like, George Eliot is like, I love everyone. Wuthering Heights is like, I hate everyone. I'm really putting things together. But yeah, so Wuthering Heights, so it's this story about this place called Wuthering Heights, and it's kind of like a frame narrative within a frame narrative, because the story is told to a stranger who moves there years after the beginning of the story starts. There is kind of like this double-sided story that happens, I guess, where the first part is key to kind of developing stuff, and then the second part is where things are kind of solved, but it's also sort of mirroring, but again like in an almost inverse way. But anyway, so like the stranger moves after the first part has like been finished, and then the second part kind of happens whilst he's there, if I remember correctly. But yeah, he's being told the story by somebody who was like a servant in the household of Wuthering Heights, and yeah, it's about Kathy and Heathcliff, who's this adopted boy into their family, and it's kind of about them and their love for each other, and also their like hatred for each other, but also it's, yeah, just like staggeringly beautiful, but also like absolutely awful. And when I was reading it, you know, stuff like lines from it just rebounded around my head and over again. And I did actually read it, or like I read half of it I think when I was a kid, but I did reread it / read the whole thing last year for Victober, so I'm counting it as on this list. The next one is a book I also read last Victober, which is Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, which is just a really lovely book. That's not to say it doesn't explore like tragedy or anything, but it's very different in tone and stuff from Wuthering Heights and things. It doesn't have that kind of like grim, gritty sort of depth to it, but it does have this like really beautiful sense of place and sense of groundedness. It's about Bathsheba Everdeen, well sorry, my camera is dying so I'm also like trying to speed up, and her life. She comes into ownership of a farm and it's sort of just about like what happens there, and she has like 3 main suitors, and again it's kind of like about what happens there. Gabriel Oak, one of them, is just like a really gorgeous character. I think he's done just really well, and I don't think like the film or anything could he ever get to like how beautiful a person he really is. But yeah, like it's really lovely, and I don't know, it has this really lovely sense of, well like I said, I guess sense of place, but also a sense of time in a way that's like, I really loved how that was described in the novel. And yeah, I don't know, like I guess describing it after Wuthering Heights, it isn't quite as like appalling, so it doesn't quite like reach the heights that Wuthering Heights does, but it is just this really lovely novel about kind of like witness and care and yeah, like tending, because it really is about like farming and being in the land and on the land, and so like attending to the creatures and the plants and then also the people on it. The next one is Villette by Charlotte Bronte, which nobody is surprised I picked because I talk about this novel all the time, so I won't really talk about it much, but it is about Lucy who goes to Belgium to become a school teacher, and yeah, it's like about a lot of things. Yeah, I love it. I think it's a great book, and it's really vivid, and I love Lucy Snow a lot. She's quite like an unreliable narrator, which is also very interesting, and not like a boring way. She really keeps you on your toes. Yeah, it's also kind of like about unrequited love / love in general. There's a lot of like humour, I guess, reading it now, because Lucy has a lot of really strong opinions. So, you know, like she hates Catholics and stuff, but she obviously goes to a place where there's loads of Catholics, like she's teaching Catholic children. So like, you know, what does she expect? But yeah, it's really great, and there's something about it that really just captures like a sort of trans-temporal sense of being like a lonely woman in the world and like not really knowing what to do with yourself, and I guess being like a bit of a judgmental bitch, but also having like kind of a heart of deep love and need for care, like we all do. You know, like passionate lonely women, obviously I'm gonna love it. It also does have some like really interesting stuff, I think, about like gender and queerness, because there's like a part with like a play specifically, which plays into a lot of like ideas about like gender theory and performance, that kind of thing. I will link like videos where I've spoken about all of these books, because then I can go into them a bit more in depth / hopefully in like a different way or whatever. And then the last novel is Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I think I probably read maybe like 4 years ago now, and you know, I don't think about it as much as maybe I thought I would, because I did really love it when I read it, but I do think it's a wonderful novel. I think maybe part of it is just because like I actually, you know, I didn't particularly enjoy North and South, and I didn't particularly enjoy Ruth. In fact, I hated Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I read recently, so that's kind of like muddied my memory of Wives and Daughters, but I do think it's a great book. It's quite a long book. In fact, I feel like the majority of these are like fairly long, not like massively, but quite long. Yeah, so Wives and Daughters is about Molly Gibson, I think, whose mother has died and then whose father like remarries, and it is kind of a bit like sort of fairy tale-y without being an actual fairy tale. You know, she inherits like a new sister because of her dad's remarriage, I think, who was called Cynthia, and Cynthia gets into trouble. She's quite like a sort of classic heroine, and Molly is quite silent and, you know, sweet and just kind of like kind, I guess. And yeah, it just sort of, it's about her, I don't know, it's quite mundane. I actually think it is historical fiction. I think it's set in the like late 1700s, but nobody ever really remembers that. Yeah, this one is the one that I also remember the vaguest, because it was the longest to go, and also because I haven't like returned to it particularly in the way that I have with the others. It's also actually unfinished, but you know what's going to happen. Like, it's fine. We all know what was going to happen in the end. And it is actually also interested in kind of like scientific development, especially because one of the characters, I think he's like interested in insects, isn't he? And there's some commentary on poetry and writing within it too. And yeah, it's just sort of, it's about these people's relationships with each other. Whereas with like Middlemarch, for example, I do feel like the way that people are interacting with each other is very developed. I don't think it has quite that same sense of development, and it really does have these like key vocal points of people, like character points of people, you know, who really like shape the narrative, and it's not so much like weighted in a place, but it is still like an interesting read. You know, often like talking about books that you love, you know, it makes you want to reread them, but I'm not entirely sure if I do want to reread this one, but I would still definitely include it on this list. It's just, yeah, maybe it was like a favourite for me when I read it a couple years ago, and it just wouldn't be anymore, and that's fine. Yeah, I did also kind of want to give like an honourable mention to The Image Breakers by Gertrude Jakes, which is like just a Victorian novel because it squeaks in into 1900. But you know, it's definitely not like a favourite, but I've just thought about it so much, I feel like it would be a disservice not to like mention it as like an honourable mention here. So yeah, there's that. It's a new woman novel, and it's thinking about socialist politics and women and free love, and it's all very interesting in my opinion. Cool, I think that's everything I wanted to say. Definitely let me know like what you thought about my choices and what your choices are. If you would like to be tagged for this, then consider yourself tagged. But otherwise, yeah, I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!